Babylon, a city that became a legend, and a city that turned to ruins before it was even truly founded. How is that possible? Let us race across 1,000 years of history to resolve this incredible contradiction. We will tell the story of Babylon's greatest rulers, men like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II. We will discover how the true Tower of Babel was built and uncover the reality behind the Hanging Gardens of Semiramis. We will soar above the magnificent Ishtar Gate, and we will touch the lives of ordinary Babylonians, people whose lives were governed by laws that Europe would not match for another 3,500 years. Searching for the origins of Babylon is like peering into a thick fog. We do not know exactly who founded this legendary city, or even when. The first written mention of Babylon dates back to the 23rd century BCE, during the reign of the grandson of Sargon of Akkad. Back then, the city was called Kadingir, a Sumerian word meaning Gate of God. The more familiar name emerged later in the Akkadian language. The locals called their city Babalu, which also translates as the Gate of God. Gradually, Akkadian displaced the Sumerian language, and the new name stuck. From there, it passed into ancient Greek, taking on the sound the world still knows today: Babylon. The true history of Babylon begins after the fall of the Sumero-Akkadian kingdom, around 2000 BCE. Babylon was seized by nomadic Amorite tribes. Roughly a century later, an Amorite chieftain named Sumu-Abum founded the first Babylonian dynasty. Historians call the era of this dynasty's rule the Old Babylonian period. Upon becoming ruler, Sumu-Abum went to work. He erected massive defensive walls around the city. He dug vital canals to supply it with water, and he built grand new temples. Then he launched military campaigns. He captured and destroyed the neighboring city of Kazalu. He forged powerful alliances with the rulers of Kish and Sipar. By the end of his life, Sumu-Abum had expanded his domain to include the cities of Dilbat and Kutha. From an unremarkable little town, Babylon transformed into the capital of a future, celebrated power. But let us step back for a moment. Let us return to the Sumero-Akkadian kingdom and examine the world in which Babylon existed before its great rise. The Sumero-Akkadian kingdom was a mighty state in the territory of ancient Mesopotamia. At its peak, it stretched from the coast of the Persian Gulf all the way to northern Mesopotamia. The kingdom endured for 1 century, from the late 22nd to the late 21st century BCE. During this period, Mesopotamia was concluding the early Bronze Age. People were transitioning from copper tools and weapons to bronze. Babylon, at that time, was just an insignificant city within this massive empire. But empires rarely last forever. The Sumero-Akkadian state began to crumble toward the end of the 21st century BCE. Amorite tribes attacked constantly, leaving absolutely nothing in their wake. The devastated locals, starving and desperate, rose up in hungry revolts. In the south, the Elamites rebelled, demanding their independence. The kingdom weakened, and ultimately, it fragmented into separate, warring states. Mesopotamia became a bloody arena for endless wars. The main feuding centers were the city-states of Isin and Larsa. In the north, the kingdoms of Assyria and Mari formed. Eshnunna rose in the east and Elam in the south. Individual states formed brief alliances, but more often, they clashed violently with one another to expand their borders. None of them held a decisive advantage. The entire region descended into chaos. It would take a visionary leader to change this. Later, the Babylonian king Hammurabi would become the one to unite all the warring states of Mesopotamia. forging them into a single, unstoppable power, the Babylonian kingdom. Hammurabi came from the first Babylonian dynasty. He was the sixth ruler of Babylon after Sumuabum. The exact meaning of his name remains a mystery. Some scholars rate it as Hammurabi, meaning the ancestor is great. Others translate it as the ancestor is a healer. Hammurabi was born in the early 19th century BCE. To put that into perspective, around the exact same time, on the other side of the world in prehistoric Britain, the construction of Stonehenge was finally being completed. Hammurabi inherited a kingdom stretching from Sippar to Marad, in what is now modern-day Iraq. At the time, it was far from the most powerful state. Greater threats loomed on the horizon. The neighboring kingdoms of Larsa, Eshnunna, Elam, and the realm of Shamshi-Adad I. But Hammurabi was brilliant. By warring with some and cooperating with others, by the end of his life, he had subjugated all the lands of Mesopotamia. But let us take it in order. In his early years of rule, Hammurabi did not wage wars of conquest. Upon ascending the throne, the young king first forgave the debts of all his subjects. Over the following years, he built and restored temples. He strengthened the city walls, and he dug essential canals. It was only in his 7th year of rule that he finally went to war, marching on the cities of Isin and Uruk. He conquered them at once. Isin and Uruk were then under the control of Rim-Sin, the ruler of Larsa. Yet Rim-Sin did not respond to Hammurabi with immediate war. He simply ceded the two important cities. This may have been because before the attack, Hammurabi had formed a strategic alliance. He partnered with Shamshi-Adad I, the leader of the Upper Mesopotamian kingdom. Rim-Sin likely decided to bide his time and prepare for a later war. A year later, Rim-Sin sent his troops against Hammurabi. He reclaimed Isin and Uruk. From then on, a long, tense peace was established between the two rulers. Hammurabi decided to expand his borders in other directions. In his 11th year of rule, he rejected an alliance proposal from the king of Eshnunna. Instead, he allied once again with Shamshi-Adad, the man who controlled all the major cities of Upper Mesopotamia. At the time, this was the most powerful ally a king could ask for. Hammurabi's most decisive, victorious campaigns began only in his 30th year of rule. He crushed the combined forces of Eshnunna, Malgium, and Elam. After this triumph, Hammurabi declared for the first time that the borders of the Babylonian kingdom encompassed all the lands of Lower Mesopotamia. Such a bold declaration meant one thing. Hammurabi no longer recognized the authority of Rim-Sin. War with Larsa was now entirely inevitable. Hammurabi marched his troops directly to the walls of Larsa. Rim-Sin held out under siege for a grueling month, but he was ultimately defeated. His subsequent fate remains unknown to history. From the vanquished king, Hammurabi inherited a grand title, the father of the Amorites. After the death of his ally, Shamshi-Adad, the kingdom of Upper Mesopotamia collapsed. The states of Assyria and Mari gained their independence, but not for long. In his subsequent campaigns, Hammurabi subdued them as well. In his 38th year of rule, he captured Eshnunna. He repelled the fierce onslaught of nomadic tribes. After this, all of Mesopotamia fell under his absolute control. Hammurabi was a masterful negotiator and a brilliant strategist. He chose his allies carefully and waged war with incredible success, even far from his homeland. These skills helped him transform Babylon from an unknown town into the capital of a celebrated kingdom. But his military genius was only one side of his extraordinary personality. Hammurabi also became one of the first true lawmakers in human history. And it was this that brought Babylon into its true golden age. Having consolidated his vast power, Hammurabi launched sweeping judicial reforms. Under his direct supervision, a comprehensive code of laws was compiled. These laws defined the precise rights and responsibilities of every inhabitant in the Babylonian kingdom. The laws were carved into a massive diorite stele, crowned with an image of Hammurabi standing before Shamash, the god of the sun and justice. Hammurabi wielded absolute power. He was revered on par with a god who rules over society and establishes its divine laws. In earlier times, things had been very different. Rulers had to constantly appease the high priesthood to maintain their thrones. Babylonian society consisted of 3 distinct estates, all with unequal rights. The majority of the inhabitants were free people. They were called the Awalim, meaning man. They lived in close-knit communities and owned their own land. Hammurabi largely did not interfere in their daily lives. He even ensured that corrupt officials did not seize communal lands from the people. Nevertheless, the Awalim paid taxes to the crown. The second estate was comprised of the freed dependents, the Mushkanim, meaning one who prostrates himself. Most often, they came from the ranks of palace or temple slaves. Though free people and even nomads could sometimes fall into this class. The Mushkanim had no roots in any community, or they had voluntarily severed their communal ties. Some gave up their land after going bankrupt. Others did so, seeking advancement in royal service. The Mushkanim held land on royal territory and served the government directly. Their activities were managed by city administrators, many of whom were themselves Mushkanim. This unique estate could simultaneously include both impoverished farmers and high-ranking state officials. Finally, the third estate consisted of the slaves, the wardom. Among them were captured warriors, or people who had lost their freedom after committing a crime or failing to repay their debts. Slaves could belong to the king, a temple, or a private individual. All of a slave's meager possessions were considered the absolute property of their master. Legally, slaves were equivalent to objects. They could be sold, bought, or pledged as collateral. If someone maimed a slave or took their life, it was considered nothing more than damaging someone else's property. The guilty party compensated only for the material loss of the owner. But here is the crucial point that made Babylon unique. In Babylon, no one was born entirely without rights. If a slave woman and a free man had children, those children were born free. Even if the father did not officially acknowledge them, the enslaved mother could not be sold away. She remained in the household with her children. Many of Hammurabi's laws were based on the principle of talion, equal retribution, an eye for an eye. However, liability for crimes depended heavily on your social standing. For instance, if a free man damaged the eye of another free man, the offender's eye was destroyed in return. But if a free man knocked out the eye of a Mushkanim, the accused simply paid about 1 pound of silver. For injuries inflicted on a slave, a fine equal to half the slave's value was imposed. Under Hammurabi, the high priests and the temple lost their strong influence over lawmaking. For the first time in history, crimes began to be treated in a purely legal sense, not as violations of sacred commandments, but as offenses against human life and the foundations of society itself. Judges were now direct appointees of the king, drawn from the city's inhabitants, while priests served only as assistants. A judge who disregarded the law could be stripped of his position immediately. Hammurabi's laws also protected the rights of women and children to an extent rarely seen in that ancient era. A woman was considered a full person and an independent member of the family. After marrying, she could leave her husband if he turned out to have premarital debts. If her spouse was unfaithful, falsely accused her of adultery, or physically assaulted her, she could take her case to court, and upon proving her claims, she could legally dissolve the marriage. She was then completely free to remarry. If a wife was childless or fell seriously ill, the husband had the right to take a second wife. However, he could not simply choose a concubine on his own unless his wife herself offered him a slave woman for cohabitation. Furthermore, a husband could not abandon a sick wife. If a man's wife died, he could not claim her dowry for himself. The entire inheritance went directly to their children. If a man had children from both his wife and a lawful concubine, then after his death, every single child received an equal share of his property. The concubine mother and her children were immediately granted their freedom. Of course, not all residents of Babylon enjoyed perfectly equal rights. Yet, the honored position of women in the family and the legal protection of children from a father's tyranny speak volumes about the sophistication of Babylonian society. Hammurabi took the first real step toward a just civilization, ensuring that, as stated in his own laws, the strong shall not oppress the weak. After Hammurabi's death, the Babylonian kingdom lost its vast influence. For 5 centuries, Babylon slowly faded into the background, and then a new threat emerged: Assyria, a nation that had grown into a terrifyingly mighty power. To repel this Assyrian threat, Babylonian kings desperately sought support from neighboring lands. This bitter standoff between Babylon and Assyria would stretch on for another 500 years. By the 8th century BCE, Babylon was severely weakened by the relentless onslaught of the Chaldeans. Finding themselves in a highly vulnerable position, the Babylonian rulers did the unthinkable. They asked for help from their very enemies. The Assyrians. Babylon and Assyria formed an alliance. It was a fateful, devastating decision. The Assyrian king gladly helped defeat the Chaldeans, but in return, he sent his own governor to rule over Babylon, and so the once proud Babylonian state found itself firmly under Assyrian control. The Babylonians soon realized the fatal weakness of their position. Traditionally, Assyrian kings appointed their eldest sons as governor of Babylon. But this tradition was broken by King Sennacherib. He had previously tried to rule Babylon directly, but the city constantly, fiercely rebelled against him. So, Sennacherib decided to change his approach. He placed a young Babylonian aristocrat named Belibni on the throne, a young man who had been raised at the Assyrian court. The calculation was brilliantly simple: a ruler familiar to the Babylonians, yet entirely loyal to Assyria. Sennacherib himself called him a puppy raised in my palace. But the puppy quickly bared its teeth. Belibni conspired with his fellow Babylonians and raised a massive revolt. Sennacherib returned, crushed the rebellion, and violently removed Belibni. This time, he appointed his own son, Ashur-nadin-shumi, as governor. But his rule did not last long either. The Elamites invaded Babylonia. They captured the young prince, and, in all likelihood, they executed him. After this, revolts in the city erupted one after another. Furious and grieving, Sennacherib returned to Babylon with a single dark intention: to completely destroy the city. This is how the Assyrian king recorded his own ruthlessness. With the bodies of Babylonians, I filled the squares of the city. Gold and precious stones I divided among my people. The gods who dwelt in the city were seized by the hands of my warriors and smashed. The city and its houses, from foundation to wall, I destroyed and consigned to fire. In the end, Sennacherib ordered the charred ruins to be flooded. His soldiers breached the Araktu River that ran right through the city. Water rushed in, filling the ruined streets. Thus, the legendary city of Babylon was destroyed. And then, something happened that contemporaries perceived as a direct act of the divine. In 681 BCE, Sennacherib was brutally killed by his own sons. For the people of Mesopotamia, this was no mere palace conspiracy. It was the terrifying verdict of Marduk. The god whose sacred statue had been forcefully taken from Babylon had exacted his revenge through blood. Babylon's restoration began almost immediately after Sennacherib's death. The monumental work took about 20 years, and the finest builders in the known world participated. New palaces were erected on the sites of the destroyed ones, shining with unprecedented splendor. The Babylon whose magnificent ruins have largely survived to our day was laid down precisely then. In the 7th century BCE, the city's grand restoration was carried out under the new Assyrian king, Esarhaddon. And it was around this time that a thrilling new chapter in Babylon's history opened, the Neo-Babylonian period. The surviving Babylonians gradually returned home. Along with them came the Chaldeans, who by that time already populated much of Mesopotamia. The very same Chaldeans whose raids Babylon had once fiercely repelled now began to intermingle with the local population. They gained civil rights, and they began to heavily influence the affairs of state. Among these Chaldeans was a man named Nabopolassar. He served as one of the elite military commanders of Nineveh, the mighty capital of Assyria. But when the Assyrian Empire began to decline and lose its iron grip over its subject nations, Nabopolassar saw his opportunity. He raised a massive rebellion along with his army. He loudly renounced Assyrian authority and marched directly toward Babylon, conquering one city after another along the way. In time, Nabopolassar became one of the most powerful rulers of all Mesopotamia. In the conquered city of Babylon, he ascended the throne, and he founded the 10th Neo-Babylonian dynasty, also known as the Chaldean dynasty. Later, in 612 BCE, his combined forces brought down the untouchable capital of Assyria. Nineveh fell, and so a Chaldean rebel brought the lands of Mesopotamia under his absolute rule. After Nabopolassar's death, power passed to his ambitious son, Nebuchadnezzar II. He continued his father's monumental work, and he became the king who led Babylon into a glorious new golden age. Nebuchadnezzar II was born around 630 BCE. To frame this in history, at roughly the same time in ancient Greece, the legendary poet Sappho and the future founder of democracy, Solon, were born. They were all nearly the exact same age. Nebuchadnezzar's name in Akkadian sounded like Nabu Kuduri Usur, meaning, Nabu, protect my firstborn. The god Nabu, in Akkadian mythology, was deeply revered as the patron of wisdom. Nebuchadnezzar inherited an empire that already stretched across the entirety of Mesopotamia. Yet, he hungered for more. He continued his father's relentless conquests. He pushed the empire's borders even further outward. The only unconquered rival remaining in the known world was Egypt, and this was simply because the two sides were perfectly equal in military strength. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, the Neo-Babylonian kingdom experienced an unparalleled golden age. Tribute from subject cities that had previously flowed into Nineveh was now redirected straight to Babylon. Residents of other cities flocked to relocate to the new capital. Plenty of hired work appeared, and the population grew at a rapid, astonishing pace. Early in his reign, Nebuchadnezzar made a bold decision. He chose to restore the grand ziggurat from the ancient time of Hammurabi. This ziggurat was called Etemenanki, which beautifully translates as House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. Its meticulous construction was overseen by a master architect named Arad Ahishu. Once completely rebuilt, Etemenanki became the tallest structure in all of Mesopotamia. And centuries later, it would become the primary inspiration for the biblical myth of the Tower of Babel. It was dedicated entirely to Marduk, the the supreme reigning god of Babylon. The colossal construction of city walls, vital canals, and sprawling palaces was carried out primarily by hired workers. Their difficult labor was paid for directly by temple officials, who simultaneously oversaw every major project in the capital. The immense funds came straight from the temple's deep reserves, consisting mainly of royal gifts, glittering gold, heavy silver, and the spoils of endless war. Captured foreigners, contrary to popular belief, provided only supplementary labor. But the grand construction of Babylon certainly did not end there. For his beloved wife, Amytis, Nebuchadnezzar built the legendary Hanging Gardens, the second of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. According to the romantic legend, Amytis was a Median princess. She was heavily weighed down by the dusty, scorching heat of Babylon. She desperately longed for her homeland, the cool, shady forests and the high green mountains of Media. To ease his wife's deep sorrow, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the construction of a sweeping, elevated oasis. The Hanging Gardens? A place where she could hide from the city's bustle and lose herself in comforting memories. In classical literature, these gardens bear the name of the mythical queen Semiramis. The prototype for Semiramis was Shemuramat, a powerful ruler of Assyria who lived 2 centuries before Nebuchadnezzar was even born. Perhaps then, the second wonder of the world should truly be called the Hanging Gardens of Amytis. And yet, a mystery remains. To this very day, it is entirely unknown whether the Hanging Gardens actually existed. Not a single solitary Babylonian text from Nebuchadnezzar's time mentions them. Everything we know comes from Greek and Roman authors, writing many centuries later. This is the only one of the 7 wonders of the world whose very existence remains in serious question. But even if the Hanging Gardens are merely a beautiful romantic legend, what Nebuchadnezzar actually built around Babylon was absolutely real, and arguably far more impressive. Nebuchadnezzar erected a massive double wall entirely around the city. It possessed a combined thickness of about 90 feet. That is the staggering width of a modern 4-lane highway. Chariots drawn by teams of 4 horses could race along the top of these walls at full speed and still have plenty of room to easily turn around. For comparison, the Great Wall of China is roughly 15 to 30 feet wide. Babylon's walls were 3 to 6 times wider. It calls to mind the towering, impenetrable walls from dark fantasy tales. The city itself covered an astonishing 2,200 acres, an area roughly comparable to modern-day downtown Chicago. Its population, by various historical estimates, reached 200,000 people. Does that number not sound impressive today? Then consider this context. In those exact same years, mighty Athens had only about 90,000 inhabitants, and Rome was still just a collection of mud huts, a mere village. Babylon most likely became the very first city in human history to cross the 200,000 mark. Now, let us speak of the Ishtar Gate. This was the magnificent main entrance to the city, and it was designed so that anyone approaching it would have the breath taken right out of their lungs. The gate rose 50 feet above the ground, while its deep foundation extended another 46 feet below the earth. The total height of the structure was a dizzying 95 feet, the height of a modern 9-story building. But it was not just the height that was utterly staggering. The entire facade of the gate was covered in brilliantly glazed bricks of vivid cobalt blue. This was not simple paint. It was a thin, vitreous layer of glass that gleamed in the Mesopotamian sun so intensely that from a distance, the gate appeared to be carved from solid lapis lazuli, the most precious blue stone of antiquity. Nothing like it existed anywhere else in the entire world. Against this radiant blue background, terrifying figures were laid out. 575 mythical Mushusu dragons and fierce bulls, perfectly arranged in 13 rows. Each figure was carefully assembled from individually molded bricks, much like a giant puzzle or mosaic. Now, imagine you have passed through the shadow of the Ishtar Gate. You find yourself standing on the grand processional way. It stretched for over half a mile, up to 65 feet wide, wider than Broadway in New York City. On both sides of the street rose walls 50 feet high, adorned with 120 life-sized glazed lions. Each lion was about 6.5 feet long, assembled from 46 individual interlocking bricks. And here is a brilliant, subtle detail that shows just how deliberate all this ancient construction truly was. The lions on the eastern wall stepped forward with their left paw, while those on the western wall led with their right. If you walked down the center of the road toward the gate, an optical illusion took hold. It seemed as though two living columns of fierce lions were slowly, menacingly bearing down on you from both sides. Yet, the history of this Neo-Babylonian kingdom did not last long. It endured for roughly 1 single century. The reign of Nebuchadnezzar II coincided with the absolute peak, the ultimate prosperity of Babylon. But a swift, brutal decline began almost immediately after his death. As early as 539 BCE, the great Persian king Cyrus II conquered Babylon. From there, Persian power only grew and expanded. Key territories were forcefully stripped from Babylonian control, though the city itself miraculously retained self-governance for several more decades. But everything changed in 481 BCE. The Babylonians raised a desperate, bloody revolt against their Persian overlords. It failed. The Persian king Xerxes mercilessly crushed the uprising, and he utterly devastated the city of Babylon. As a final, heartbreaking symbolic gesture, the Persians carried away the sacred statue of Marduk. And so, the divine protector of Babylon departed his city forever. The once reborn capital began its long, quiet descent into the twilight of history. And now, the most important part. Do you remember the paradox we started with? Babylon became a legend and turned to ruins before it was even founded. Now you know exactly how that is possible. The Babylon of Hammurabi, that same celebrated legendary Babylon of law and early civilization, was completely destroyed by Sennacherib and drowned entirely beneath the dark waters. It is gone, washed away by time. The sweeping ruins that modern archaeologists have unearthed, the broken walls that stand today in the baking Iraqi desert, those belong to a completely different Babylon, the one built by Nebuchadnezzar on the exact site of the one that was destroyed. The legend was born long before the stones that remain from it. We know Babylon by the monumental ruins of its second life, but we will forever remember it for the genius of its first.